People ask me what I remember most about that rotation on Veth Station, and I always give them the same answer: the counting. Not the smell of the wound, though that was something I will carry to my grave. Not the sound the Krath made when I first put my hands on it, though that sound, low, from somewhere behind the ribcage, not quite a growl and not quite a word, was the sound I heard in my dreams for the next 3 years. What I remember most is my own voice. Flat, even, doing the only thing I knew how to do when my hands were shaking, and I couldn't afford for them to shake. 1, 2, 3. I'll get to that. My name is Petrovas. I was a field medic, level 3 certification, attached to forward observation post Kuldar, which sat on the moon Veth like a tooth someone had knocked loose and never quite pulled. We had 12 people, a generator, 2 sled runners, and enough medical stores for 30 days of moderate activity. Moderate, in the language of the people who wrote that supply estimate, meant bruises, sprains, and 1 or 2 infections. What it did not mean was the Krath. Nobody had written the Krath into any of the supply estimates I ever read. Veth Station existed because the moon had a long-spectrum atmospheric sensor array that the Alliance needed running, and the Krath, 3 months into a territorial expansion that our high command was still describing as a skirmish, had started making runs at Veth's upper orbit. Our job, 12 of us, none above the rank of sergeant, was to keep the array functional and call in anything that looked like a landing approach. We were not soldiers, mostly. We were technicians and support personnel and me. We were a listening post in a war that hadn't yet decided it was a war. I had been posted to Kuldar for 47 days when the attack came. 47 days is long enough to know a place if you pay attention, and I pay attention. It is the professional requirement most basic to medicine, and it crosses over into the rest of your life whether you want it to or not. I knew the way the dome panels yellowed at the corner seams where the sealant had dried unevenly. I knew the hour of the morning when the generator's ambient vibration shifted pitch by a half tone, and I knew that it didn't mean anything, but I noted it anyway because noting things is what you do. I knew the medical bay the way you know a small space you inhabit for hours at a stretch every day. Which shelf brace was loose, where the cold came in under the eastern seal, the exact angle you had to approach the supply chest from if you wanted the lock to release on the first try rather than the third. I knew the 12 people the way you know colleagues you haven't chosen. Sergeant Hold was direct and competent and not especially warm, which suited the posting. 2 of the technicians, Finn and Marrow, had worked together before and had a shorthand that excluded everyone else, which was irritating in social terms and irrelevant in professional ones. The rest were variations on what a forward listening post recruits: people who can function in a small space under sustained low-grade stress, who don't need much variety, and who don't push too hard against protocol, because protocol is what makes a small, isolated group coherent. I had treated 4 injuries in 47 days. Finn had burned his forearm on a heating element. One of the others, Delacroix, I think, I am less certain about names the further from that day I get, had a respiratory infection that I cleared with a standard course of treatment and a note in the file. 2 others had soft tissue problems I addressed with compression and elevation, and the recommendation that they do less of whatever they had been doing when the problem developed. None of it had been serious. None of it had required the part of my kit I kept at the back of the second shelf, behind the standard supplies, where the things lived that I hoped I wouldn't need. That kit had 7 types of suture material in it, ranging from the fine monofilament I used for surface closures to the heavier braided thread I carried for deep tissue work. It had a full set of needle drivers and forceps and scissors, a skin stapler, 2 kinds of hemostatic packing, wound irrigation supplies, and a collection of dressings for situations I had been trained to anticipate and hoped were theoretical. I had repacked that kit 6 times during the posting, the way you do when you know that boredom is a form of attention erosion. You repack the kit. You verify the inventory. You keep your hands familiar with the geography of the things they might need to find quickly, in the dark, in a bad situation. In the 47th day of bad situations, those 6 repacks were the only reason I knew where everything was. Then on a morning in what passed for spring on Veth, the sun at its highest angle, the light through the dome panels a pale, flat white, the war decided. The attack came from 3 directions at once, which later analysis would describe as textbook Krath ground tactics. At the time it felt less like tactics and more like everything that had been solid suddenly wasn't. 2 of our technicians were in the sensor array when the first blast hit. Sergeant Hold had everyone else moving within 90 seconds. There was a protocol for this. Shelter positions, emergency beacon, wait for extraction. The extraction window was 6 hours at minimum. We had 90 seconds to get there. I made it to the medical bay because the medical bay was my shelter position. I had 60 seconds to inventory what I had and what I might need, and what I definitely wouldn't be able to use in the next 6 hours. And then the second blast hit and the lights went amber and I sat down on my kit and held the supply shelf and waited for the building to stop shaking. It stopped, the amber lights didn't. I did a full sweep of the bay in the first 10 minutes. I was alone. The radio was on emergency band and I could hear Hold's voice and 2 others, broken up, talking about the outer perimeter. I could hear the Krath too, that was new. You don't normally hear the enemy in a listening post-action. You watch screens, but whoever had hit us had come in close, and the sounds coming through the walls were not sounds I had a name for at the time. I gave them names later. I had time to do that. The medical bay was a prefab module on the west face of the post, with a door that sealed from the inside and a viewport panel above the supply shelf that let in the flat pale light. I had one operating surface, a folding table I'd reinforced with a brace I'd made from a broken sled runner, because the factory brace had cracked in the first week, and one overhead light bar that was running off the emergency circuit. Everything was lower and hotter than it should have been. The amber gave everything the color of old bone. Through the first hour I sat with my back against the sealed door and did what I always do when I am waiting in a situation I cannot affect. I made lists. I listed what I had in the kit and in what order I would use it for various scenarios. I listed the 12 names on the post and marked, mentally, the ones I could account for through the radio and the ones I couldn't. I listed the protocol steps for every injury I had ever managed under field conditions, and the deviation steps for when the protocol didn't fit. Making lists is not the same as being in control. It is much smaller than that. It is a way of keeping your mind busy with concrete things so that it doesn't fill the space with the things it can't do anything about. The sounds through the walls changed. I couldn't have told you how exactly. I don't have a trained ear for the sounds of conflict. But there are changes you register before you understand them. And by the midpoint of the first hour, I had registered that whatever was happening on the eastern side of the post was closer than it had been, and moving in a way that had a different quality than before. Less organized, maybe, or more desperate. I noted this and filed it and did not investigate, because my shelter position was the bay, and the bay door was sealed, and investigating would have required me to unseal the door, and the protocol was clear on shelter positions. I sat against the door. I sat with my kid. I waited. The Krath came through the east face of the module in the second hour. I didn't hear it coming. That is the thing about the Krath that never made it into the briefing documents I'd been given, because the people who wrote those documents had been working from survey footage and second-hand accounts, and survey footage doesn't give you sound design. The Krath are large, I knew that. Bipedal, with a bone-heavy frame and forward-angled joints that make their movement look, on footage, like something between a loping run and a controlled fall. They are covered in a layered integument that sits somewhere between scale and heavy scar tissue, ridged and overlapping, and the coloration varies from individual to individual. The one that came through my east wall was a deep, dusty amber that in the pale light looked almost brown. They have 4 upper limbs, the bottom 2 shorter and set lower on the torso, used primarily for gripping and secondary manipulation. Their faces are wide, the orbital ridges heavy, the eyes, and this is the part that the footage never quite captured, set wide enough that each one has a nearly independent field of view. They see almost everything. Almost. What the Krath also have, and what every briefing document did mention, though without adequate emphasis, is wound pride. It is not a perfect translation. The concept in Krath's social structure is more specific than the word pride captures. Wounds are status. The accumulation of unsown, untreated, deliberately unhealed damage is a record, a curriculum vitae written in scarred tissue. To accept medical intervention is, in their framework, to erase part of your record. It is to say, this wound was too much. I could not bear it. It is a form of social diminishment that their culture treats with the same seriousness that other cultures treat bankruptcy or exile. A Krath warrior who allows another person to close their wounds has, in the language of their caste structure, submitted. To accept treatment is to acknowledge that you needed help, and the Krath do not acknowledge that they need anything. The deepest irony, and I understood this even at the time in the abstract, though I had no idea how soon it was going to become very concrete, is that wound pride exists in a species that is spectacularly good at taking damage. They are not fragile creatures who need a philosophy of stoicism to get through. They are genuinely, structurally resistant to physical trauma in ways that mammalian physiology is not. Their circulatory system has redundancies. Their bone structure distributes impact loading in ways that ours doesn't. They heal. Not fast, not magically, but they heal thoroughly, and the tissue that forms in the wake of a healed wound is denser than the original integument, which means that an old scar is, quite literally, structurally superior to unscarred skin. The record is not only cultural, it is written into the tissue in a material sense. An elder Krath warrior is armored in part by their own history. This is worth knowing if you ever find yourself in a room with one. Not because it changes the immediate calculus. A Krath that wants to end you is going to end you regardless of what you know about their integument, but because it changes something about how you understand what you are looking at. You are not looking at an anatomy like yours that happens to be in a foreign casing. You are looking at a different solution to the problem of existing in a world that will try to damage you. Theirs is, let it damage you, hold the damage, and become stronger at the damaged place. Ours is, repair the damage, return to baseline, and continue. Both strategies work. They are simply very different from each other. I knew all of this. It was in the briefing documents. What the briefing documents did not tell me was what to do when one came through my east wall, bleeding from a wound in its left shoulder that I could have fit my fist into, and collapsed against the operating table. My first instinct was to push back against the far wall, and I did that. My second instinct was to understand what I was looking at, and I did that more slowly. The Krath warrior was not attacking me. Its bottom limbs were folded under it in a way that looked involuntary, a collapse rather than a crouch. Its upper right limbs were braced against the table. The left upper limbs were not functioning. The shoulder wound was the reason. I could see, even from the far wall, that the joint had been compromised. The shoulder of the left upper limbs was not sitting correctly. The two limbs hung at an angle that the anatomy did not support. The Krath was looking at me with one of its wide-set eyes. It had come through my wall by accident. That was my first coherent thought, and it held up to examination. There was no tactical logic to breaching a medical module. Whatever had happened out there, this individual had been driven back hard enough, damaged badly enough, that it had found the nearest wall and gone through it, and the wall happened to be mine. I stayed against the far wall for about 30 seconds, which was the time it took me to accept that the Krath was not going to stand back up. Blood, not red, a dark, almost purple shade that looked black in the amber light, was moving down its arm and onto the floor at a rate I did not like. The joint was bad. The blood loss was bad. I am not a person who can watch things bleed out. I was trained not to be, and the training took, and even sitting against the wall I was already running the math in my head without meaning to, because that is what training does. It runs without you. The Krath watched me with one eye. I picked up my kit. I walked to the table. I set the kit on the corner of the table where the Krath's arm was not, and I opened it, and I started laying things out in the order I would need them. The Krath made a sound. I have tried many times to describe that sound accurately, and I have never quite managed it. It was not a sound of aggression, though it had volume. It was not pain. The Krath do not vocalize pain, as a rule, not in any way that a human ear parses easily. The closest I have come is that it sounded like the beginning of a question, not the question itself. The posture that precedes a question, when you are not certain you should be asking it. I didn't look up from my kit. I'm just going to look at it, I said. I don't know why I said it. The Krath doesn't speak. Not in any language I had, I knew that. But there is something about extreme stress that makes the human animal want to narrate, to put words into the air as a form of I'm not sure. Architecture. Something you can build your hands work inside. Something that says, I am a person doing a thing, and I know what the thing is. I moved to the left side of the table, where the wound was, and I looked. The wound was a penetrating injury to the upper left shoulder, which in Krath anatomy sits at the junction of two of the four upper limbs. The joint complex there is enormous, 4 limbs need a complex anchor, and it had been breached by something that hit hard and angled, probably from above and to the left. The entry channel was wide and the edges were ragged, not clean, which meant a ballistic event rather than an energy weapon. Good in one sense. Ballistic wounds have predictable behavior. Bad in every other sense. The joint was involved, there was extensive surrounding damage to the integument layers, and the blood loss was ongoing. I could treat the blood loss. I couldn't restore the joint, that was surgical work beyond what a field kit could support. But I could pack the wound, close the surface layers, and buy the time that might matter. I could also get killed trying. The Krath's right upper limbs were still functional. They were braced on the table and they had claws broad and flat at the tip, not like a cat's, more like a heavy trowel. The kind of thing that, if it moved in the wrong direction, would end the conversation very permanently. I was standing within range of both of those limbs. I knew I was. The Krath knew I was. We both understood the geometry. I picked up my irrigation syringe. I need to flush it first, I said to the table, or to myself, or to the general principle of narrating your actions under pressure. It's going to be cold. The saline was cold. It was always cold on Veth. The module's heating ran off the same emergency circuit as the light bar, and cold saline in a traumatic wound is not a pleasant experience for any species whose nerve endings are functional. The Krath moved. Not toward me, sideways. A full-body shift that ground its lower limbs across the floor and made a sound that I felt in my sternum. Its right upper limbs went rigid on the table. Every muscle in that enormous frame locked. Then it went still. I kept irrigating. I used the whole syringe, and then I loaded another and used that too, because the wound was deep and the debris in the entry channel was significant, and you irrigate properly or you don't irrigate. That is not a philosophy, that is just medicine. You do it right or you cause a different problem. When I was done with the second syringe, I looked up. The Krath was looking at me, not with alarm, not with the posture the briefing documents described as pre-aggression, and I had those descriptions memorized because there is a limit to how far training will take you, and then memorized descriptions of alien body language have to carry the rest. This was something else. Its head had moved in a way I didn't have a name for. A slight angle, the wide-set eye that was facing me fixed and still, not blinking. The Krath don't blink the way we do. They have a secondary membrane that moves across the eye occasionally, but the wide-set eyes themselves are remarkably still. It was watching my hands. Not my face, my hands. I got the hemostatic packing out. Field hemostats are not a pleasant tool to use under any circumstances. They go into a wound, not onto a wound, into it, and they create a chemical reaction that promotes clotting. And in a wound this size, in a tissue structure this dense, I was going to have to pack deep. I knew what that was going to feel like, even if I had no exact knowledge of Krath pain perception. Some things translate. This part, I said to the air, is going to be worse. I packed. I don't have a gentle way to describe it. You create pressure, you maintain pressure, you don't stop. The Krath made no sound. That was more disturbing in some ways than sound would have been. Its right upper limbs pressed the table hard enough that I heard the material flex. That folding table with my improvised sledge runner brace took the weight, which I was briefly grateful for, and the whole enormous frame trembled with the sustained effort of holding still. But it held still. When the packing was seated and the bleeding had slowed to something survivable, I stood back and gave myself 30 seconds. I needed it. My hands were steadier than my chest. The Krath's eye had not moved from my hands. I thought about what I knew: wound pride, status in scarring. To accept treatment is to submit. This Krath had come through my wall and it had not attacked me. It had collapsed on my table and it had not attacked me. It had endured cold irrigation and hemostatic packing, and I had watched it endure those things without sound, without language, with nothing but the rigid controlled stillness of something that was choosing, actively and deliberately, not to use the force it still had, and it had not attacked me. I thought about the word the briefing documents had used: submit. I did not think the Krath was submitting. I didn't have a better word then. I've had years to find one. The one I've settled on is waiting. The Krath was waiting to see what I was going to do. I had at that point closed a wound and opened my suture kit. There are two kinds of suture work. There is the kind you learn in a room with good light and a training model, and an instructor who tells you when your tension is wrong. And there is the kind you do in amber light, in a medical bay that is not your size, on an anatomy you have never touched before, while the patient watches your hands with an eye the size of your fist and has the capacity to end you and has chosen, so far, not to. Both kinds require the same technique. That is the thing about technique. It is the thing that is still true when everything else is not. The knots are the knots. The throws are the throws. A surgeon's knot is not the same as a square knot, though it looks similar to someone who hasn't tied one. The key is in the first throw. You cross the suture twice on the first pass. That's what makes it a surgeon's knot rather than a square knot, and then you lock it with the subsequent throws. The number of throws depends on the suture material, the tension, the tissue, and the situation. For the material I was using, in tissue with the density I was working with, and with the movement stress that the joint would put on any closure I could achieve. 7 throws. That is what I had worked out, standing at the table, eyeing the wound and the instrument in my hand. 7 throws to close a surgeon's knot and have it hold. I had learned, years earlier, from a woman named Akafer who had been my primary instructor, and who had a habit I picked up without noticing until she pointed it out. She counted the throws out loud. Not loudly, not performatively, just a number for each pass in the same steady tone you might use to read out a set of coordinates. It was, she told me when I finally asked about certainty. You cannot lose count of something you are saying. Your mouth knows where you are, and your hands listen to your mouth, and the knot gets the right number of throws because there is no possible confusion. It is a very small system of reliability inserted into a situation that may have very little of it. Akafer had been doing surgery in places with less light than this and more chaos for 32 years when I met her, and she had the kind of hands that moved at the same speed regardless of what was happening around them. The same speed in a training room, the same speed in a field tent with 4 people trying to stabilize a casualty, and someone outside making sounds that indicated more casualties were on the way. She had told me once that the counting was not just for accuracy. It was for the patient. People hear a calm voice counting, she said, and some part of them believes it's fine, even when it isn't. The counting is proof that whoever has your life in their hands knows exactly where they are. She had been talking about humans. She had been talking about a controlled surgical environment where the patient was conscious and in distress. She had not, as far as I know, been thinking about a species from outside our system with a physiology she had never studied, in a broken listening post module, with a war going on outside the walls. But the principle holds, I think, further than she intended it. I had been counting throws out loud ever since. I threaded the needle driver. I looked at the wound. I looked at the edges of it, which in any other situation I would have spent more time preparing, but the integument layers of the Krath don't debride the way human tissue does, and I was working with what I had. The wound had sealed enough at depth to hold a surface closure. The surface closure was going to be imperfect, and it was going to look nothing like what you'd see in a teaching video, and it was going to hold, because it had to. I set the tip of the needle driver. "1," I said. The Krath did not move. The first throw went in. The suture material I was using was monofilament, heavier gauge than I would normally use for a surface closure, but heavier was right for this tissue. The integument layers are tough, not delicate, and you need the material to have some body to it or the knot will slip. The first cross, twice over, placed correctly. I drew it down and began the second pass. 2. There is a rhythm to it. You develop the rhythm without thinking about it if you do enough of this, the placement, the turn, the draw, the number. And once you're in the rhythm, you can sustain it even when your hands are telling you they want to shake. You don't let them. You count. The counting is the anchor. The rhythm is the rope. You hold onto the rope. The monofilament caught the overhead light when I drew it, a thin flash that I tracked with the corner of my eye without letting my full attention leave the wound. The Krath's integument at the wound edge was different from the surrounding tissue, more pliable, I found, which surprised me. I had expected it to behave like leather, resistant and stiff. The damaged layers had a give to them. I adjusted my tension accordingly. You adjust to what you find. That is not philosophy either, it is just practice. 3. The Krath exhaled. Not a growl, not the low chest sound from before. An exhalation. Long, controlled, the kind of breath that tells you something has been held and is now being released, not because the situation is resolved, but because holding it was no longer possible. I kept my eyes on the wound. I kept my hands moving. 4. The right upper limbs shifted on the table, not toward me, down slightly. The enormous frame lost an increment of rigidity. I noted this the same way I note everything when I'm working, clinically, peripherally, without stopping. The note was, it's settling. I kept counting. 5. This is the thing about counting, about putting the numbers out loud into the air. You are not doing it for yourself. Or you are, in the sense that it keeps you correct and grounded. But there is something else that happens in a room when someone begins to count with regularity, with evenness, with the total lack of alarm. Something in the air changes. Something that was uncertain hears the counting and categorizes it. Here's the pattern. A pattern is a predictable thing, and a predictable thing is a safer thing than the thing that could, at any moment, stop or alter. I did not know if the Krath understood this. I don't know if I understood it, not yet, not consciously. But I know that by the fifth throw, the energy in that room was different than it had been at the first. What I did notice by the fifth throw was the sound inside the bay. Not outside, outside was still the muffled, irregular cacophony of a fight ongoing, but inside, the bay had become quiet in a particular way. The hum of the emergency circuit, the small sounds of the needle driver and the suture, my own voice, flat and even, saying a number. And under all of it, the Krath's breathing, which I had not been fully conscious of noting until it was no longer the ragged, compressed thing it had been when the Krath first collapsed. The Krath's breathing had slowed, not to human respiratory rates, which I know, but to something more sustainable than what I had been hearing. something that was not fighting itself. 6. The knot was taking shape. I could feel it, that particular resistance you get when a surgeon's knot is setting correctly, when the throws are building on each other the way they're meant to, and the tension is right across the material. There is a version of this job where you are fighting the material, where nothing sits right and every pass is a correction, and the end result is something you look at and think, this will probably hold. And there is a version where the material and the anatomy and the tool are all working in the same direction, and this was that. I don't know why. Maybe the Krath's integument was more cooperative than I expected. Maybe the gauge was right. Maybe I had finally achieved a calm that had nothing to do with the situation and everything to do with having done this enough times that, even under amber light, even in front of something that could kill me with a single movement, my hands knew the geometry. 7. I drew the suture down, set the tension, and tied off. The knot sat flat against the wound edge, which is what you want. Not proud, you don't want a knot that stands up from the tissue. You want it pressed in, integrated, part of the surface. This one was. 7 throws done correctly in sequence out loud. I cut the suture tail. I set down the needle driver. I did not step back. I just stopped moving, the way you do after a run when your body is still but the motion is still draining out of your muscles. I looked at the closed section. In the amber light against the deep dusty brown of the integument, the suture line was almost invisible. A thin seam. One section of a wound that had 6. But the section was closed and the section was holding, and that was one more thing that had been open and was no longer open, and in the arithmetic of field medicine that counts. I had sutured one section of the wound. The wound was large. There were more sections. I knew that. I also knew, in the way you know things when you are very calm and very tired, that what happened in the next few seconds was going to matter more than any of the suture work I had just done. I looked up. The Krath's eye was on my hands, still on my hands. It had not moved to my face, which was where a human would look instinctively when the immediate action stopped. We look at faces for information. The Krath was looking at my hands, and the quality of its gaze was something I did not have language for at the time. I've thought about it since. I've thought about it quite a lot. The best I have come up with is study. The way a craftsperson watches another craftsperson's hands, not assessing whether to trust them, trying to understand what they just saw. I said nothing. I picked up the needle driver again. 1, I said. Second section, more throws, same count. I will not tell you that by the third section the Krath was calm, because that is not a word I can stand behind. Calm is too simple. What it was present. Utterly present, in the way that very large things with very good senses are present, fully committed to the immediate reality, not planning, not responding to anything outside the room. Its right upper limbs were no longer pressing the table. They were resting on it. The lower limbs had shifted to something closer to a seated position, which for the Krath anatomical structure meant the weight was differently distributed, more sustainable. The frame was still enormous. The claws were still right there. Nothing about the situation was resolved or safe, but the room had found an equilibrium that I was not willing to disturb. I counted. I want to try to explain what the counting was in that room at that point, because I think there is something in it that is worth saying carefully. The Krath, as a culture, have a relationship to endurance that is not metaphorical. When they speak of bearing something, and I've read a great deal of translated Krath speech since Veth, more than most, they mean literally, physically bearing it. The wound pride that the briefing documents called a steadiest structure is, at its base, a record of what a body has held. A Krath warrior with extensive visible scarring has held more. The visual record of the body is the evidence. Other Krath read that evidence. They know from looking at a warrior's integument how much has been borne, and by bearing how much they know how much more that warrior can bear, and this knowledge structures everything. Hierarchy, trust, alliance, the whole architecture of the culture. What I had not considered, What I could not have considered before that room, before those hours, is what it means to a Krath to watch something it cannot do. They are superb at endurance. They are world-class, species-class, at holding damage inside themselves without flinching. But they cannot close their own wounds, not from the inside. The Krath understand the value of what hands can do because they have hands. But the technical closure of a wound, the specific accumulated skill of irrigation and packing, and a surgeon's knot tied correctly in 7 throws, they cannot do this to themselves. They must, if they do it at all, allow it to be done. And the structure of their culture means that allowing it to be done carries an enormous cost, and so most of them do not allow it. Most of them bear the wound as it is, and add it to the record, and walk forward with the damage written on them, because the alternative is to have it said that the wound was too much. I had thought about this in the abstract before Veth. Most people on our side of the line had thought about it in the abstract. There are papers on the Krath caste structure that predate Veth by more than a decade, written by people who had accessed treaty-adjacent intelligence and done their best to turn raw observation into navigable theory. The papers are not wrong, exactly. They capture the shape of the thing. What they cannot capture, what no document can capture, because it is not a fact you can record but an experience you have to sit inside, is what it feels like to be in a room where that culture is not theory. Where it is standing in front of you, on your table bleeding, having made a choice that cost it something real. Here is what thinking about it in the abstract does not give you. It does not give you the experience of being in a room with a Krath who is watching your hands, not watching your face, not watching the weapon you don't have, watching your hands, watching them do a thing that it cannot do itself, and that is costing it something significant to allow, and that it is, despite the cost, despite everything its culture says about what this moment means, allowing. Watching and staying very still. I counted. The hours passed. I don't know exactly how many, because I was not watching the clock the way I should have been, but the emergency circuit lights don't cycle, and the module temperature was stable, and I worked by those signals instead. 4 more closures after the first 2. 6 total sections of the wound, at varying depths, with varying materials where the suture ran out and I had to improvise. By the 3rd section, I had developed a feel for the integument that I hadn't had at the first. It is one of the things that experienced practitioners of any manual discipline know. The feel comes when you stop trying to impose what you know onto what you are touching, and start letting what you are touching teach you. The Krath's integument in the wound area had a structure that was different at different depths. The outermost layer was the most rigid, dense, and overlapping. The individual scale plates still present even in the damaged zone, some of them cracked rather than removed entirely. Under that, the tissue was different, something closer to what you'd call fascia in a mammal, fibrous and tough, but with a suppleness to it that accepted the suture well. Deeper still was a layer I could feel but not see clearly in the amber light, and I made the decision early not to probe past where I needed to be. You do what you can reach. You don't go looking for new problems. On the 4th section, I ran out of monofilament. I have thought about that moment many times. It is a small moment, an inventory problem, a material substitution, not a crisis in any objective sense. But there is something about the moment when you reach for a supply and the supply is not there that can undo you if you let it. I did not let it. I went to the braided thread, which handles differently, less stiff, more cooperative under tension, but with a higher risk of tissue reaction in some anatomies, and adjusted my technique. The throws on braided thread need to be tighter on the initial cross. I adapted. That is also medicine. You adapt. I narrated the change to the air. Different material, slightly different tension, not for any particular audience. Just to keep my voice doing what it had been doing, because by then I was aware in the peripheral clinical way that you are aware of things when your hands are occupied, that the Krath's responses to the work correlated with the sound of my voice. When I was working quietly, there was a subtle shift in the frame, not aggression, not alarm, more like a background vigilance activating. When I spoke, that vigilance eased, not all the way, but enough. I was aware of this without making a decision about it. I just kept talking. Toward the end, I used a skin stapler for 2 sections, not ideal but adequate, and the stapler didn't require counting, so I narrated instead, telling the air what I was doing and why, the same flat, even voice, because by then I understood that the voice was part of it. The voice was doing something. The Krath let me work. There is a thing that happens in long procedures in the middle of them when the adrenaline of the opening has metabolized and the end is not yet in sight. A kind of suspended state. You are no longer reacting and you are not yet completing. You are simply in the doing of the thing, hand after hand, throw after throw, and time becomes a different texture. Not fast, not slow, just the sequence of actions. I have been in this state in controlled surgical settings, and I have been in it under field conditions, and I have always found it, despite everything, to be one of the more sustainable states available to a person. You are not afraid in this state. You are not confident. You are simply occupied, fully, with the thing in front of you, and that occupation is a kind of mercy. I think the Krath found something similar. I have no language for what the Krath experience internally. I had none then, I have somewhat more now, but still far from enough. But there was a quality to its stillness in those middle hours that was different from the controlled rigidity of the early work. The rigidity had been effortful. This was different. It was a stillness that didn't seem to cost anything. The enormous frame on the table, the weight of it resting rather than held, the right upper limbs no longer braced but simply placed. The breathing even. The wide eye occasionally crossing to the wound, and then to my hands and then back, without urgency, without the edge that had been there before. We were in it together in some sense. Not the same experience, but the same room, the same problem, and a shared interest in the same outcome. That is as close as I will come to describing it. When I was done, when all 6 sections were closed or stapled or packed and dressed, and the wound was as handled as I was going to be able to handle it, I stepped back from the table and sat down on my kit. I sat down hard, because my legs had been on this task for a very long time, and they wanted to be not on a task. My hands ached. The knuckles of my right hand had a cramp in them from the needle driver that I knew from experience would take a day to release. I pressed them together and breathed. The Krath had not moved off the table. I looked at it. It was looking at me, not just the hands now, but the whole of me with that wide-set, steady, non-blinking gaze. I didn't know what it was reading. I still don't. But it held the look for a long time, long enough that I stopped expecting it to end, and then it moved. Not toward the door, which would have told me something. Not toward me, which would have told me something else. It moved one of its right upper limbs, the larger, the stronger, and set it flat on the table, palm down, claws inward, in a gesture that took me several seconds to understand was a gesture at all. The limb was extended, the claws folded, the attitude of the whole limb quiet. It was the posture of something that was not, at this moment, a weapon. I looked at the limb. I looked at the claws. I looked at the broad, flat palm with its heavy ridged integument and the scars already on it, old ones from before today, from whatever the record said about this individual's history. I reached out and put my hand on it. I don't know why I did that either. There was no protocol. There was no training. There was, at that point in the day, nothing left in me that was protocol and training. Those had been running the hands, and the hands were done. And what was left was just me, sitting on a kit in a broken module on a moon I hadn't wanted to be posted to, putting my hand on the limb of a Krath warrior because it had put its limb out flat, and I didn't know what else to do, and it seemed like the right thing. The integument was rough, warmer than I expected, though I don't know why I expected anything particular. The ridges of it were raised and irregular, old damage in there and newer damage, and the whole texture of it was nothing like skin in the way I understood skin. But it was warm, and it was still under my hand, and it did not move. We stayed like that. I don't know for how long. The radio came back. Not the emergency band, A full-spectrum burst that meant Hold's main unit had found power again, which meant something significant had changed in the tactical situation outside my walls. I heard Hold's voice, clipped and careful, calling out coordinates and personnel count. I heard other voices answering. I heard, underneath the voices, the particular absence of the sounds that had been coming through the walls for the past several hours. The Krath outside had stopped doing whatever they had been doing. I did not move my hand. The Krath's eye had moved toward the sound of the radio when it burst on. Then it moved back to me. I don't read Krath faces, no human does, not fluently, not yet, but the eye came back. I noted that. Hold was calling for a personnel check. I reached over with my left hand and keyed the radio. Vast Medical Bay, contained, I said. There was a pause that told me something about the state of things outside. Any injuries? Hold said. I looked at the Krath. The Krath looked at me. Working on it, I said. Hold's pause was longer this time. Then, copy Vast, stand by. I put the radio back. The Krath had not moved. I had not moved my hand, and the Krath had not moved, and the room was very quiet except for the hum of the emergency circuit and the distant, now quieter sounds of whatever was being resolved outside. I should tell you that we did not communicate. I want to be precise about this, because what happened that day has been described in ways that I find frustrating, in reports and in accounts that came later, when it became the kind of event that gets written up and cited and used as an example of various things by people who weren't in the room. We did not talk. We did not reach some profound mutual understanding. I did not learn anything about Krath culture that day that I didn't already know from the briefing documents, and the Krath did not learn anything about human culture that I can verify. What happened was this. A medic sutured a wound. She counted out loud while she did it. The patient held still. That is all that happened. That is also, I have come to think, exactly enough. There is a version of that day that I have heard told in which I am brave, in which I made a choice, deliberately, to extend care across a species boundary, and the Krath responded and something changed. I don't think that version is wrong exactly, but I think it is the wrong scale. I didn't choose to be brave. I chose to pack a wound because the wound needed packing. I chose to suture because the suture needed doing. I counted because Akafor taught me to count, and the counting kept my hands right. None of it was a statement. All of it was just the job done in sequence, the way the job is supposed to be done. The bravery, if there was any, was in not doing the other thing, in not staying against the far wall, in not waiting the clock out while something bled on my operating table, because the something was large and alien and frightening. The bravery, if we're looking for it, was in reaching for my kit. Everything after that was just technique. Extraction came in 4 hours. The fighting outside had wound down by then to what the after-action report called a disengagement. The Krath elements that had hit the post had pulled back, for reasons that were debated for a while in the intelligence assessments, and that I have never had enough clearance to know definitively. When the bay door opened, it was 2 of our people from Hold's group, and they stopped in the doorway the way people do when they see something they were not prepared to see. I was on my kit. The Krath was still on the table. The wound was closed. The room smelled of antiseptic and blood, and the particular mineral smell of the Krath that I have since learned to recognize as a normal species characteristic and not a symptom. Vass, said the first person through the door. I don't remember her name. I remember she was very young and she had her weapon raised and she did not know where to point it. Lower that, I said. She lowered it. We need to call command about the second person started. I know, I said, give me a minute. I stood up from my kit. My legs were unhappy about this, but they cooperated. I walked back to the table. The Krath's eye was on me, had been on me since the door opened. I looked at the closed wound, all 6 sections, suture and staple, intact. The bleeding had stopped. The dressings were holding. I looked at the Krath. The Krath looked at me. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that my hands hadn't already said. 7 throws 6 times over said it. The surgeon's knot correctly placed said it. The counting said it, for anyone with ears to hear, which is everyone. You don't need a translator for counting. Numbers are the oldest language. 1 through 7 in the same flat voice, over and over, is something that any species with a concept of sequence can hear. I stepped back from the table. I picked up my kit. I nodded at my 2 people in the doorway, and the 3 of us moved out of the bay, and I did not look back. I heard the Krath move behind me when we were in the corridor, a heavy sound, weight redistributing, the limbs finding a new configuration. Not leaving, just adjusting. The extraction shuttle had a medical berth. I sat in it and let someone else check my hands. The right one was cramped badly by then, and the joint pain was something I would need to address before the next day's work, whatever the next day's work turned out to be. I let someone else check me, and I looked out the shuttle viewport at Veth growing smaller below us, the dome of the post visible for a moment and then not, and I thought about counting. About how a number, said clearly in a steady voice, is a form of proof. Proof of what exactly I wasn't sure. Proof that something is happening. Proof that it is not out of control. Proof that someone is paying attention, keeping count, holding the thread of what is supposed to happen next. 1 through 7, 7 times roughly. 42 throws in total, give or take the stapled sections. I was told later, much later, that the Krath warrior remained in the medical bay until the Alliance's first contact team arrived at Veth 14 days later. The bay had been secured, monitored. The contact team included a linguist who had been working Krath-adjacent postings for 8 years, and the account she gave of that first meeting is one I have read many times. She said the Krath warrior was cooperative in a way that the team's models had not prepared them for. It held still. It answered questions, through the available translation systems, with directness and without the deflection that those systems had learned to expect. It was, she wrote in her report, as though someone had already negotiated the fundamental question, that someone in that room is here to help and the other is willing to allow it, and the rest was procedural. She did not know, when she wrote that the fundamental question had been negotiated in a broken module on the west face of a listening post, in amber light, over a wound and a needle driver and a very old counting habit. I don't correct people when they say that what happened on Veth was historical. I think it was historical, in the way that a lot of things are historical without meaning to be. Nobody in that bay was making history. I was making sutures. The Krath was holding still. But sometimes I think about what would have happened if my hands had been shaking too badly to work, if I had stayed against the wall, if I had counted only 6 throws or 5, and the knot had shifted under the stress of a living, breathing, moving body and the wound had come open again, and the Krath had seen the thing that was supposed to hold, not hold. I think about that sometimes, not with fear. Just with the particular respect you develop for the small decisions, the ones that feel like technique and not like choice, that turn out to be both. 7 throws, that's all. 7 throws in the right order said out loud by a person who was trying to keep her hands right. The image I carry from that room is not the moment the contact team arrived, or the moment the extraction shuttle lifted, or the moment anyone said anything official about what any of it meant. It is the moment just after the 7th throw of the first suture, the moment when I set down the needle driver, the moment when I stopped moving and the room held the stillness I had made inside it. The Krath looking at my hands. The knot set flat, the way you want it. Everything for one moment holding.